So down to it's Thursday, and we are coming close to the halfway point of our study through the Proverbs. And we come to chapter 14 today, and because we're about halfway through, I'm trying to gauge the reception of it, different things that we could do differently. And one of the comments that I've had is that perhaps reading the entire chapter is a bit much to take in, because there's not sort of the narrative flow to the Proverbs that other aspects of the scriptures are. Each verse sometimes, or two or three verses, kind of stand alone, and then there's almost a new theme, and it's maybe hard to just kind of keep up. And maybe it'd be better to let you read the entire chapter on your own, which we're going to encourage you to continue to do. We want to read through the entire book this month. But what I'm going to do is I will read a shorter portion of it, give our devotional or thoughts on it, and then let you read the rest of the chapter on your own. Now, I hope this doesn't give any of us an excuse to not read the entire chapter. We want to be able to be reminded that the most important part of any teaching, any devotional, any sermon, any commentary, any conversation about the Bible is always the Bible. And so please, let's keep focused on that. So I'm going to read a little portion, and then we'll kind of back up and give some thoughts on that. So chapter 14, on January the 14th. And I'm actually reading from the Christian Standard Bible, which is a relatively new version. I'm not using it all the time, but some of my brothers have suggested that it puts things in a little more illustrative language. And so I thought, well, let's use this for some of the conversations that we're walking through this portion of scripture for. And so I'm going to begin with the familiar verse in verse 12 of chapter 14. It says that there is a way that seems right to a person, but its end is the way of death. Even in laughter, a heart may be sad, and joy may end in grief. The disloyal one gets what his conduct deserves, and a good one what his deeds deserve. The inexperienced one believes anything, but the sensible one watches his steps. A wise person is cautious and turns from evil, but a fool is easily angered and careless. A quick-tempered person acts foolishly, excuse me, and one who schemes is hated. The inexperienced inherit foolishness, but the sensible are crowned with knowledge. That's the end of verse 18. And so I'm considering today, as we had our Zoom call last night, and we've had, generally 5, 6, 7 people who are there, and that's about what we had last night. 2, 4, 6, 7, 8, 9. Oh, maybe I had closer to 10 last night. I think there was almost 12 now that I count. But we haven't had a large representation of the church. My idea that it'd be great for us just to show up to encourage each other hasn't been particularly compelling. And so there's other ways we can do that, to be sure. But it's always worthwhile, and it's always a good time for us, those few of us that get together that do that, and we enjoy ourselves. And again, I commend it to you as an opportunity to be encouraged by being an encouragement. It's one of the things that sometimes we miss in our day. I think that we get encouraged when people do for us, and we certainly should do that. We should be appreciative of that, express our gratitude towards that. But there's also a kind of joy and encouragement that comes from the simple knowledge of knowing I've been an encouragement. Now, that has its attendant dangers as well. We can give into pride and ego and sort of pat ourselves on the back, on the other hand. But it's worth it. It's worth the risk. It's worth the risk to seek to be encouraged, just because you're being encouragement to other folks. And one of the things that Proverbs says here in verse 12 is that there is a way that seems right to a person. I think most of us are hearing that there is a way that seems right to a man, but its end is death. Here it says specifically, there's a way that seems right to a person, and it's just simply being inclusive that way, as it should in this case. There's things that we think are the right ways to live, that the end of it is destruction of ourselves. And that's generally, in some ways, an overall consequence of not giving in, or not giving our lives to, or giving in to the counsel of the Lord and living the way that he calls us to live. We think we know better. And for the most part, we go through our lives living that way, and it is better for a season. And sometimes we think, well, that means that God doesn't care, or that God, people even say things this ridiculous, well, God doesn't exist because I don't believe in him, or I don't think so, or I don't like that idea, as if we believe something into existence, as if we conjure it up by our belief. God is there. I am who I am. His very name is his being. And it doesn't change whether or not we believe in him or not. What changes is the outcome of our lives. And sometimes what changes even is the consequences that we endure while we're living in this life. Any of us would know, who are part of the Downsview Baptist Church here, that when we live as if we can just ignore God, well, there are consequences for that. And sometimes God graciously and patiently bears with us, as it were, in that Romans chapter 2 in verse 4 reminds us that the patience of God is intended to lead us to repentance. We mentioned it before. Here in the Proverbs, he's saying that, listen, there's a way that seems right to us, but we can't diagnose our lives continually based on what we think is right for us, or even the consequences of the life that we see. Because this is the way of it is death. Its end is the way of death, or the way to death, the path towards death. We are leading ourselves down this primrose path that's going to end in our own destruction if we insist on doing things the way that we think is best, rather than giving ourselves to the wisdom of God. And that's part of the reason that we're seeking prudence. I know it's an old-fashioned word, but it means wisdom, the right way to do things, what seems wise. And there are aspects of the scriptures again and again and again that are going to give us principles to live by. And this one here is, we're saying, look, you got to live coram Deo, which is the Latin phrase which means to live before the face of God. Understand that that's how we're living, is before the face of God. And to ignore that and to live as if we're not, that's the principle, is just not going to, we have no expectation of that to go well for us. And so when he says there's a way that seems right to a person, what he's getting at is the right thing that the way we gauge and diagnose the rightness of our life is not just what we see happening around us, or frankly just the decision that we have, or the conviction that we have, and that's even if those convictions are mirrored by other people in the world or society at large or in general. The diagnostic that we have to apply to our lives to be sure that things are going to go well is the diagnostic of the scriptures. And he starts to give some things that seem almost counterintuitive, doesn't he? Verse 13 says, even in laughter a heart may be sad, and joy may end in grief. Pam and I lost one of our longest standing Christian friends just this past week, Kathy Schmidt. Her and her husband Fred were two of the very first people to befriend us. In fact, as I've been meditating on Kath's life the last few days with appreciation and thanks to the Lord, I thought, I wonder if there was anyone who were legitimately walking with the Lord who were our friends before Kathy and Fred. And I'm kind of thinking, I'm not sure who they were. There was a lot of Christian folks around us and other people who were very nice to us. But we had a Bible study in their home. I was all excited about reading the Bible. I didn't know which end was up. I didn't barely know the Bible had two testaments at that point in my life. But they were Christian folks who had invited us into their home, and our son Brandon was born within about 5 or 6 months of us beginning the Bible study. There was another family, as well as Kathy, who just had a daughter, in their case, about 6 or 8 months older. But we were often sitting in the back room as the rest of the Bible study was happening in the living room. There's a little ante room, and the kids were on the floor, and we were listening and trying to take part as best we could. But sometimes we were just kind of chatting with each other, and we really developed a friendship. One week Pam would be back there, and one week I would be back there. And you know, these were people who, and Fred continues to be someone who just goes out of his way, and Kath always went out of her way to make us feel encouraged, make us feel a part of things, make us feel important. And you know, as they have a memorial service coming up in a few days, I thought there's going to be a lot of laughter, because there's a lot of things that Kathy and the family would have to laugh about, and they laughed easily, they laughed often. It was central to a lot of our times together, really enjoying ourselves. And I thought, sometimes that can almost seem offensive to people in a funeral or memorial service. In the conversations before and after, you think, this is a sad time. This is a time of grief. We've lost one of our own. She's only 59 years old. You think, boy, it's way too young for someone to die. And yet there's something healthy and appropriate. I remember John Piper talking about that when people smile at a funeral, it's just something that said health, that the relationship's healthy, that we're living in reality, that we're willing to laugh in the midst of situations that were sad. The proverb says, even in laughter, a heart may be sad. That can be the case. I remember when Pam's grandmother passed away, and our boys were quite young. Brandon might have been 4 or 5 years old, and Pam had a picture with her sisters from the funeral. And she has 3 sisters, and so the 4 gals were there, and they were all dressed up. They all looked wonderful. And when Brandon saw the picture, I remember him being a little upset, saying, "Why are you all smiling? It was Grandma's funeral. You're supposed to be sad." And out of the mouth of babes, right? I mean, there's a certain sense you're not wanting to be flippant and silly and goofballish around a funeral time, but there's a certain joy that comes from the assurance of someone's salvation, not the pretending of someone's salvation, not devising a new idea that, well, everybody's in a better place because I knew them. We tend to change our theology awfully quickly sometimes at funerals. But when you have the rock solid assurance that this person was living for the Lord, that their diagnostic of life was not their own way, but was God's way, Christ's way, following He who is the way, the truth, and the life. No man comes to the Father but by me. When someone was living for that, there's a kind of joy from that. And one of the things I've often said to folks at funerals, listen, don't feel guilty. I try to tell them this in advance when we're preparing. Don't feel guilty when you feel a bit light tomorrow, that you're happy about things, find yourself enjoying yourself. Don't feel guilty about that, because the hardest time may very well not be the time that, boy, there's a lot of old friends around and your family's together and you enjoy them, and the stories you're telling are probably not the stories of the person's last days and their pain and their discomfort and their misery, but you're swapping stories of the good times, and that's going to make you feel good. The proverb ends in verse 13, and joy may end in grief. So that even in laughter, a heart may be sad, which you might understand, but joy may end in grief. If someone goes home and they're by themselves and the bed is empty where the spouse used to sleep, and the house in a couple of days maybe is empty altogether because your friends have left. They've gone back out of town, or they've got back home, or life's gone on. It can be 2-3 months later. Some of you who've lost loved ones, even in this last year or two, you know exactly what I mean. That joy may end in grief. And part of the wisdom of the Proverbs here is to say, listen, folks, you need to be able to deal with the world as God shows it to you. You need to deal with things that are happening in the world as God reveals them, because there's a certain kind of understanding that God really is causing everything to happen the way it's happened. God's orchestrating all of this. When we read at Christmas time that the government shall be upon His shoulders, He's governing this world, controlling, causing. Sometimes we want to give God a break. We use words like allow and permit, and as if God's just in it together with us and He's as much a victim of circumstance. Friends, that's not the God of the Scriptures, and that's not good news that that's who God was. The good news of the gospel is the good news because God really is orchestrating all things according to the determining counsel of His will. Even in Acts chapter 4, when the apostles are speaking after being released from prison and speaking about the truth of the gospel in terms of the crucifixion and the death of Christ, Acts chapter 4, verse 27, for in fact in this city both Herod, Pontius Pilate, with the Gentiles and the people of Israel, assembled together against your holy servant Jesus, whom you anointed, speaking to God, to do whatever your hand and your will had predestined to take place. And they're speaking to God and saying, look, the cross was not an accident. The death of Kathy Schmidt was not an accident. The passing of people within our congregation over these last few years that we've been around. We think of Joe, and we continue to pray for Angie. We think of Joan Boisvert, who passed away. We think of Gadiel, barely a few months old, as Jennifer and Gabriel lost him. We think of people in our church circles, Roman, who would sit in the back of the church here. Some of you who have close relatives and friends. Brothers and sisters, God is not taken aback by these things. And the wisdom of God says, trust me, believe me. Don't think that the way that you think to run the universe is best, but understand and submit yourself to my wisdom. Friends, again, want to encourage you to read these Proverbs. Just take a chapter a day. We're almost halfway through the month, and looking forward very much to seeing you as best we can. Hang in there.